From 2002 to 2004, Sayu served as New York City's first commissioner of immigrant affairs under Mayor Michael Bloomberg. In 1990, she also worked for the mayor in other capacities. In 1996, she started something called the South Asian Youth Action, SAYA, which was focusing on developing the leadership potential of immigrant youth in Queens, in the borough of Queens in New York. Now she's a PhD candidate, so she is connecting her public service, her activism, her deep knowledge of the immigrant community's issues with PhD studies in the Politics and Education program at Columbia University. She's researching political participation by low immigrants in New York City. She is also very active in, I guess, the world of cyberspace, speaking and writing regularly on immigrant issues. She's a regular contributor to the Huffington Post, Next America, which is an editorial initiative of the National Journal. Very recently, perhaps she'll tell you about that too, she had a piece in the Star Ledger that we were pretty excited about and we have up online. She's an immigrant herself of Indian descent. She was raised in Belize in Central America, and she can vote. She's a naturalized citizen of the United States. She's been here at Eagleton before, actually participating as a panelist in a program called Ready to Run. That's a campaign training program organized by Eagleton's Center for American Women and Politics, and she served as a panelist in that program. This year, she's become part of the Eagleton community as a visiting scholar, as I said before, working on our program on immigration and democracy. Her real long CV is 8 pages long, and it is full of writing, speaking, panel participation on everything from the United Nations to the Children's Defense Fund across the board. So she is a one-woman resource on this subject, and it is really a pleasure to welcome her to the Eagleton podium.
Well, thank you for that. I feel like you guys are expecting an encyclopedic resource on many things, which I can assure you I'm not, especially as I age. So I made the mistake, I think, last week of taking a workshop on better public speaking. And as a result of that, I'm nervous in a way that I haven't been nervous usually when I do public speaking. One thing that they advised was moving around in the audience, which I clearly cannot do, thanks to the literal and figurative warm embrace that you all are providing. So I'm going to start with something a little interactive. I don't know how many. Can you all see this picture? I tried to turn the screen. So I have 2 questions about this. Where do you think it is, and what do you think it is? Anyone?
Naturalization ceremony.
Very good. Where do you think it might be?
New York.
Any other guesses? Could be New Jersey, right? Well, it turns out that it's Seattle. So 2 things surprised me about this. First, that it was sunny, because I don't know. I don't really expect Seattle to be sunny. And I also expect Seattle to be full of mostly young, white, techie progressives, and maybe some East Asians. But the incredible diversity in this photograph really struck me. And it reminded me of something that I think we always forget, especially in this day and age, that the diversity of our country is across the board. It's in places like Seattle, it's in places like Clarkston, Georgia, it's in the suburbs of Illinois, and certainly here in New Jersey. And so I wanted to start with that because it's a picture that I think grounds my personal experience as a naturalized citizen and my professional experience as I go around the country. One of the things that I've noticed is that I enjoy being in other parts of the country in a way that I didn't before. And first I thought it's because I'm getting older and New York is really loud and it's really crowded. And it's really exhausting after you've lived there for a while. And then I realized that it's because everywhere I go, I can have good food now. And I mean, I'm not just trying to make jokes. I mean, honestly, I used to travel, and because I love food, I would just be miserable everywhere I was because I didn't see much diversity and I didn't enjoy the food. And really, as I have traveled now, I have had such wonderful experiences. And so, anyway, that's why I started with this picture. And I wanted to, say how grateful I am to Sophia and to Ruth and to Randy, both for giving me this opportunity, but also for making me feel very welcome and for making the opportunities for me to talk about my favorite subject, which is the new majority. And there's many ways in which I could discuss the new majority, including some of the work that I do on a day-to-day basis. But for today's presentation, I'm going to really talk about democratic participation, particularly from the viewpoint of elected officials and candidates, and try to ground it in some academic context without losing too many of you who are not here for the academic part of my presentation. But as a PhD student, I try to be academic as much as I can, which is not often, frankly. So let's start with Congress today. And I should just say that I have a handout that I'll give you at the end that, for those of you who are academically inclined, lists out a couple of the articles that I've used in my own research and in this presentation, and also has a couple of these infographics, so you don't really have to write too much down. So this is a slide that shows that the Hispanic population now is about 16% of our country's population, and that Congress is only 7.1%. Hispanic. So we have a big gap of nearly 10% to close. Among Asian Americans, the population is close to 5%, and the percentage of Congress people who are Asian American are less than 3% or under 2.5. So that's almost 50% less than what it needs to be. And if you look at state and local office, there are 500,000 state and local offices around the country. Less than 1% of those seats are occupied by Latinos and Asian Americans. And so there's a huge gap in representation that needs to be filled. And some of us think, well, obviously we need to catch up, and that we will when as the demographics continue to change. But the thing that I always say, and Debbie will back me up on this, that, women, they've been 51% of the population for quite a long time. What is it now? 16% of Congress? 18%. We've just gotten to 18%. And last year, I remember that we were all celebrating that we had 20 women in the Senate, which, I mean, it is definitely a cause worth celebrating because it's progress, but there's a big, long, hard road that we need to go on. And so for the rest of my talk, I'm going to emphasize what the benefits of that representation of people who look like the residents of this country are. And then towards the end, I can talk a little bit about how we do that at the New American Leaders Project. So political representation has three benefits among disadvantaged groups and minority groups, right? At least three benefits that I want to emphasize: descriptive, substantive, and surrogate. And in the simplest form, descriptive representation involves South Asians electing a South Asian, women electing a woman, Chinese Americans electing a Chinese American representative. Substantive representation, it can mean a number of different things, but in terms of minority groups, it means having an elected official who is introducing and implementing policy that has a benefit for that community, has a substantive policy benefit. And then surrogate representation refers to the ability of a representative to provide a kind of symbolic representation to people who feel a kinship to that person, regardless of whether they're part of that person's electoral district. So it's, African American, well, I was going to give the Obama example, but of course he represents all of us, although some people don't think that's the case. But it's, me getting elected to office in New York City, but having all South Asians around the country feel that they have a surrogate representative. And I think that's particularly important for communities where there's a first. So when the first Chinese American is elected to office, Chinese Americans around the country feel that they have a surrogate representative in government. I want to talk now in more detail about each of these, but particularly around descriptive representation. So much of what I say about descriptive representation is based on my own experience in working in these communities, in representing immigrant communities, but also academically in an article by Jane Mansbridge, and I'll give you the reference to that article that she talks about whether blacks should represent blacks and women should represent women, and the benefits of that descriptive representation. And the first benefit is around alleviating mistrust. So some of you may have had the experience of having a problem that you have to report to either a government authority or a school authority and feeling hesitant to doing that. Will they understand? Will they question? And the issue, the benefit of alleviating mistrust refers primarily to the role that a descriptive representative can play in ensuring that a community has a person that they feel comfortable going to with their problem. And I think by extension, it allows for minority groups and disadvantaged groups to feel greater confidence in government. So their entry point is this person who looks like them, who we don't always see that represented, but most often that person you feel that person is going to understand what problem you're going through. They'll speak your language, literally or figuratively. And so this benefit of alleviating mistrust is one of the sort of key benefits of having someone who looks like the residents of the community that they're representing. And then the second benefit is substantiating group interest. And in this area, I'll give you an example of an experience that I had when I became Commissioner of Immigrant Affairs. I was appointed by Mayor Bloomberg about 6 months after the attacks of September 11th. And during that period immediately following September 11th, and frankly until today, community members of South Asian, Arab American, Muslim background were targeted with harassment and hate crimes, and airport stops and that sort of thing. And I knew that experience, not because I personally had it, but because my father, my uncles, my brothers, friends, other family members had experienced that. And so when I got into office, and again, this is 6 months after September 11th, New York City was extremely affected psychologically, obviously practically, but also psychologically by the attacks. And the conversation at the table around stops that law enforcement or activities that law enforcement could engage in around immigrants was very heated and somewhat hostile, to be honest. What I was able to provide as a member of not elected but appointed office was a different perspective on what it meant to be on the other side of that. And through those conversations, we were able to develop a policy, a particular policy that allowed for protection of confidentiality of immigration status, of people who were seeking services from city government in situations where it was not necessary to ask their immigration status. So a great example of that is someone who may be undocumented or maybe a legal permanent resident and might not be eligible for a particular service from city government, but their American-born children are. And what we were hearing was that when people were trying to access those services, government workers were asking the parent about their immigration status, which was not necessary for the provision of the service. And so, without getting too much into the legalese and the weeds of how that policy was developed, I just wanted to emphasize how my presence at the policymaking table allowed for a conversation that would not have happened with any other Commissioner of Immigrant Affairs. It was just a particular moment in time in which I was able to contribute something that someone else would not have been able to do. And this idea of substantiating group interest at a time when communities are new. So if there's a refugee community settling into Washington State, where city workers, government officials don't really understand what the particular needs of those communities are. They're not hostile, they may not be negative, they just don't understand the issue. And having someone who understands those community issues, who comes from that community, is an important benefit that descriptive representation provides. Thirdly, there's the ability to rule. Now, we know that women can rule. We, I think, knew, some of us, that African Americans could rule the country. But if you recall, in 2008, during the presidential election, that was a question. Could a woman rule as president? Could an African American be president? Could he rule the country? And I think for many of us who do not have examples and multiple examples of community members who are in office, the ability of an immigrant to rule in an environment that is multiracial, for example, where people say, well, are they going to be able to take care of all voters and all constituents? Or are they only going to be concerned about their own community? Having descriptive representation allows for confirmation of the ability to rule, and hopefully sort of decreases the chances that that will get questioned in future campaigns and future races. And then finally, there's a psychological benefit that descriptive representation provides around legitimacy for the community. So for those of us who have felt that our place in this country is questioned, for those of us who don't see ourselves represented often enough in positions of power or in the media, that legitimacy is very important. Ruth refers to the Star Ledger piece that I wrote, which was about Miss America. And if you remember, she's an Indian American who's, for some people, it was a fact that was celebrated. Whatever you think about beauty pageants, that's another talk. I can have that one for you also. The piece that I wrote was in response to the hostility that we saw primarily in social media around, this idea that an Indian American was representing America. And I think that for a lot of people in the Indian American community and in a lot of immigrant communities, it provided a kind of legitimacy that our appearance and our presence in this country was able to also break that particular ceiling, right? And I think it's kind of irrelevant whether you're involved in politics or whether you support beauty pageants or frankly whether you support corporate interests, but when we see ourselves represented in positions of power, it provides a legitimacy to our presence in this country. So those four benefits of alleviating mistrust, substantiating group interest, affirming the ability to rule, and providing legitimacy are really core reasons why I do some of the work that I do in ensuring that more community leaders, not just people who happen to be immigrant, but people who are going to carry forward these ideas, are running for office and hopefully getting elected. And once elected, they can provide additional types of benefits for our community, right? The substantive representation, which I referred to earlier, I'm going to give two examples. And one is on immigration, which is, a high salience issue in the policy debate right now. You may have, for those of you who are familiar with the debate, you remember that during the Gang of Eight announcement, the Senate Gang of Eight announced their support for a bill. And I remember being struck by the fact that there were, that it was bipartisan, but also that the both Republican and Democratic senators, Menendez and Rubio, who were supporting the bill, interjected words in Spanish in their announcement, right? And there was this sort of, I'm like you and I get it kind of thing. But, and that can be very, very much filled with platitudes and mean nothing. But in this particular case, we had Latino senators from both sides of the aisle serving as champions of immigration reform. And I think that is one benefit that descriptive representatives can also provide, is taking their understanding of an issue and really linking it to support for a policy. And you all, I think, remember, regardless of what you think about the issue, Wendy Davis's sort of filibuster in the Texas State Senate. in June, was that in June or July, the sneakers, the support, actually the opposition to a bill that the Texas state legislature was going to pass. And that's another way in which it's not just immigrants, but women, LGBT folks can can serve as champions for a particular policy and send signals to the communities that they represent that they are supporters of policies that will allow for the integration, allow for better conditions for women and immigrants to be living in while they're in their communities. And then finally, I'm going to talk briefly about surrogate representation. These three examples are of elected officials who have been first. John Liu was the first, not only the first Chinese American, but the first Asian American elected to New York City Council in 2001. And what happened as a result of that is that voters around New York City, or people around New York City, and frankly around the country, who had not had an Asian American representative before, really looked to him for representation. So the South Asian community, other immigrant communities saw him as someone who could champion their interests. And he was a big champion of language access laws in the city council back in 2002, when no one was really doing that in New York City government. And we actually worked together, he and I, on the executive and the legislative side, on making sure that the city was providing language access through city agencies. So he was able to really be a champion for communities beyond just the Chinese American community and beyond the voters that he represented in Flushing, Queens. Tulsi Gabbard has been touted as the first Hindu American elected to Congress. Now, what's interesting about that is that the Hindu American identity has never really before this been a constructed political identity in the United States. But since she got elected, it's suddenly become this thing, right? Like Hindu Americans supporting Tulsi Gabbard outside of her state of Hawaii. It created a kind of resonance, and it suddenly became something that was important because people saw themselves reflected and saw their religion reflected. And it's interesting to note that Tulsi herself is actually has converted to Hinduism because her mom was a convert. So it wasn't that she was born Hindu, and yet she has been owned and appropriated because she really owns that identity of being an Hindu American. And then Tammy Baldwin is the first, and again, one of these incredible things that she's the first openly gay senator in the U.S. Senate, and has that same sort of salience for the LGBT community, someone who they can turn to as an example of what is possible within the community, regardless of whether you live in her state or not. So this type of representation I've talked about is around the kind of benefits that candidates and elected officials can provide for immigrant groups and other disadvantaged groups in our country. In my own research, I have taken this in a different direction and talk more specifically about the types of candidates that are emerging in these communities or that have been active in immigrant communities. And I want to speak with you now briefly about those types of candidates. It's a particular typology that I'm using in my own research that is more focused on South Asian immigrants in New York City, but I think has applicability for a number of immigrant groups. And there are three categories that I'll talk about. They're ethnics, and that's my terminology, deracialized candidates, which is a term that has been used before in political science literature, and then what I call new majority candidates. So ethnics, I can't move away from this, right? I can't follow the Oprah style of presentations. So what I call ethnics tend to be first-generation immigrants. Often they are people who, and I'm not passing judgment, this is purely just a category that I describe, people who may speak English with an accent, for whom English is a second language, people who, when they first arrived in the United States, did not go into community work or political work, but were business owners or teachers or engineers, and they're coming to politics as a second career. They often have some status within their own community, within their own ethnic community, and that is the base that they try to mobilize when they run for office. So they seek donations, they try to mobilize voters, they do fundraising events, etc., within their own ethnic community. What they don't have is broad crossover appeal. They don't have as many connections in the kind of outside of their ethnic group. They don't have as many connections in political parties sometimes, although often the parties will use them to check a diversity box. The important thing here is that the candidates, I don't believe, have the qualities and the skill set and the savvy to win political office. It's important that they are running for office, but they often, at least in the studies that I have done, have not successfully won because they cannot rely just on the sort of narrow sphere of influence that they have within their own ethnic community. The second type of candidate that we've seen in the South Asian community and certainly I think in other communities is a de-racialized candidate. This idea it has been developed particularly around African American politicians, but there's a study that I also refer to on the handout that I'll give you by two authors who talk about Ken and John Salazar, the Salazar brothers, and their campaigns for national office in Colorado. And they talk about how the Salazar brothers, because of their sort of phenotypical whiteness, the lightness of their skin and their ability to kind of navigate spaces that are non-Latino, were able to run fairly de-racialized campaigns. In the South Asian community, there are two high-profile examples of what I would call de-racialized candidates. They're both Republican governors of southern states, in which there are actually very few Asian Americans, certainly not enough to impact an election. One is Governor Nikki Haley of South Carolina, and the other is Governor Bobby Jindal of Louisiana. Now, Nikki Haley was born Nimrita Randhawa to a Sikh family. Her name has changed in part because she shortened her first name and in part because she got married and then converted to Christianity. Bobby Jindal was born Piyush Jindal, a Hindu, changed his name to Bobby Jindal and converted to Christianity. And so both of them have employed certain strategies in which they have really kind of de-emphasized any ethnic cues, certainly not wearing Indian clothing, minimizing Bobby Jindal's last name is Jindal, and I guess he could have been really progressive and married someone with a non-Indian name and changed his name to his wife's name. But he's definitely not a progressive, and he didn't do that, so he's stuck with the color of his skin and his name. But whatever he could do to de-emphasize any ethnic cues about his appearance and the way that he speaks and his religion, he did. And what's important to me in looking at these candidates is not just the ethnic cues, but also what they've done around policy and how they have taken steps and stances that arguably are damaging to disadvantaged groups and minorities. So Bobby Jindal was part of the birther movement. If you recall, that was the movement that was demanding that President Obama showed his birth certificate, that was rooted in kind of creating a question about the president's where he was born and about his ability to be president. And Nikki Haley has been supportive of copycat legislation of SB 1070, which was passed in Arizona, if you remember, in 2010. Was it 2010? 2011. I could be getting that wrong, sorry. And that was legislation that ensured that, or allowed law enforcement to question people based on their immigration, really based on their appearance. And she was supportive of that. So I think it's one thing when you choose to make certain decisions about your appearance or religion, it's a free country. But when you make certain choices that are really damaging to disadvantaged groups and minorities, then you're really taking a position that can be hurtful to integration. The third type of candidate, and this is my terminology, the new majority candidate, but it is based on research by Christian Collette, who suggests that there are certain types of candidates who come out of immigrant communities and minority communities who are togglers. And they toggle between their ethnic or racial identity and some other identity. So your example here in New Jersey, I think a great example of a new majority or toggling candidate is Cory Booker, someone who is comfortable with his African American identity, who is comfortable in African American settings, but has been also criticized but lauded for his ability to step outside of that identity and step outside of Newark and have kind of broader appeal among progressives, among other mainstream groups, been able to raise money. And so he's really been able to in a very sophisticated way, navigate his sort of personal racial identity as well as a kind of broader set of identities that help him in his political career. A great example of that in New York City is a woman by the name of Reshma Saujani, who just ran for public advocate. She actually lost that race, but really very strategically used her immigrant identity in her story, in her campaign speeches, went to the South Asian community to mobilize them to come out and vote, went to the South Asian community to mobilize them as donors, but then really had broad national appeal, again, among a lot of progressives and political donors who see, and I think why we respond, why I think the country responds to people like Reshma and Cory Booker, and in the way that they responded to President Obama, who's really like the most shining example of a new majority candidate, is that we are able to see, all of us are able to see something of ourselves in them, but even bigger than that, we are able to see the best of America. When we see President Obama as our president, when we see that an African American can be elected to the Senate from, let's say, a southern state, when we see that an Indian American can be elected to represent New York City, we feel really good about what we have built in this country. We feel really good about the fact that we have created a pathway for anyone to succeed. Now, of course, this is not true, but we feel that. And that's really important. I think there's a really significant role that new majority candidates can play in the political process from a kind of psychological standpoint, not just in their own communities, but for the country and for what we believe our country is and can be. And for the rest of my sort of 10 minutes or so, I want to talk a little bit about the challenges and opportunities that this landscape presents for us, this landscape in which certain types of immigrant candidates are emerging, and in particular what it means to be able to kind of foster the environment in which more new majority candidates can flourish. So let me talk a little bit first about the challenges, and one of them is right here in your backyard. Now, I don't know how well you all can see this, but this is a campaign poster from Dr. Prasad's race for mayor of Edison, and written across it is "Dot Head." And so I want to be clear that in this wonderful new majority world that I am imagining, that there is a very strong element of racism, that has not gone away, that there are many people who are uncomfortable with the changing demographics, many people who are uncomfortable with a changing status quo, even though it's not changing as fast as we think it's changing, as the congressional demographics showed you. So I think that's a very, very real challenge that we have to encounter. I think there's a second challenge that can both be a challenge and an opportunity, and that is this issue of how do you build these cross-racial coalitions? How do new majority candidates navigate the space between being, say, Latino and running in a district that is Latino, Asian, American, and African American? How do you do that if you are an LGBT person in an immigrant neighborhood that some people might feel that community is uncomfortable with the LGBT identity? How do you kind of create these identities that will build coalitions across race, across sexuality, and across gender, and across class? And so that's a really key challenge, I think, as we kind of move forward, because there was a time in our country where immigrant groups sort of succeeded each other in power, right? So we had the Irish and the Italians and the Germans. This is no longer the case. Now we have people moving in. I mean, Asian Americans are as rapidly growing a group as Latinos. They're not the same in terms of numbers, but in most parts of this country now, certainly in most urban areas and in the kind of immediate suburban areas, there are lots of communities in which Asians, Latinos, African Americans, and whites are living side by side with each other. And what my example of the ethnics within the South Asian community, what my research is showing is that it's not possible to succeed in a campaign purely based on one ethnic identity. But I think that there are opportunities that are created as a result of these challenges that is important to kind of focus on, and they're the opportunities that make me the most hopeful and optimistic. So again, this is a slide that you probably can't see back there, but Latinos are going to go from being 16% of the population to 30% by 2050, and Asians from about 6% to close to 10%. So whether we like it or not, this is the country that we are living in and that we are going to be living in. And I think where the opportunities arise there are first among young people, where we have 50,000 Latinos predicted to turn 18 every month, 1 million undocumented dreamers who hopefully are going to be on the pathway to citizenship very soon. And that kind of opportunity that exists among young people who have lived side by side with diversity is a really key part of my optimism for the future of America. But I also think that the cross-racial coalitions create opportunities for a kind of composite political identity that benefits everybody who comes into contact with elected officials. So if I am running for office in New York City or New Jersey, as I've said, it's not enough for me to run as a South Asian. It's important for me to run as an American, and as an American, I have multiple identities. I have an identity as a progressive. I have an identity as a particular party affiliation, which I'm not sure I'm allowed to say here, but you can guess. I support immigration reform wholeheartedly and not with a lot of caveats. So I have an identity as a woman. I have an identity as a parent. I have an identity as a South Asian, but as a South Asian, not just as a Hindu Indian. So I have an identity as South Asian that encompasses all that means in terms of religious diversity and in terms of regional diversity. I happen to have been born in India, but I was raised in a Central American country with a kind of Caribbean identity. So I am truly multicultural in my own experience. And so all of those identities form who I am. And I think that I'd like to think that I'm unusual, but actually there are many, many people who are like me, who have no one identity. And so in order to be successful in running a campaign, but much more importantly, in order to be successful in being a decision maker and a policy maker in this country, you need to be able to mobilize all those identities and to be able to think with all those identities in order to create policy that reflects the needs of the country that we are today, and that makes decisions that are not narrow-minded and short-sighted, shall we say, like some decisions that have been made just last week, say, for example, that we're all feeling the impact of. And I think that for some people and in some settings that seems very naive, but I will tell you that in my reality, in the world that I live in among the parents I speak to in my daughter's school, in the communities that I work in the workplaces that I encounter, and certainly in every training that we do across the country, whether it's in Phoenix or in a suburb of Illinois or in Yakima in Washington State, that diversity is really alive and well, and that there is no one I have met who is an immigrant who is only thinking about their particular identity. Certainly no one who has really kind of integrated themselves into the American mainstream. And so for that reason, I am very optimistic about the role that the new majority can play. Because I think that this is the America that we all want to be part of, and that we all are part of, whether we're somewhat uncomfortable with it, embrace it, or are slowly getting used to it. Thank you.
And we are filming today's program to share on our YouTube channel and would like to incorporate all of your questions and comments into that. So Sayu, if you would like to take any questions, I will pass the mic. And I just ask everyone to please say your name and how you're affiliated with the university, or how you came to where you're from here in New Jersey. Start with
Kelly Dittmeyer from the Center for American Women in Politics upstairs. And I think the conversation about the sort of deracialized candidates is interesting to think about when we think about surrogates and sort of role models, symbolic representation. Do you think that, and I think we see this with women, I sort of question this, that having candidates who may not seem to represent the community can be a deterrent, to the public or to folks thinking about running? Is that something, you look at a Bobby Jindal and you may be South Asian and you say, I don't want to have to deracialize in order to be a candidate. Do you think that there's a ripple effect on a negative side of that?
So in the case of Bobby Jindal, for example, partly because he was the first governor and the first sort of congressperson in this generation, because actually the first Asian American congressperson was a Sikh in 1956. So people actually, Democrats and Republicans supported his campaign, Democrats and Republicans from the South Asian community, because, again, he provided that surrogate representation. I think for people, look, politics is bad business right now. Nobody wants to be involved in politics because what we see is not attractive. And so I think it's more that we already have a negative feeling about being in politics, and then you see what you have to give up. I do think that it hasn't really deterred that many people from being part of the Republican Party, because I do think the Republican Party is very good about, I think that what I've heard, how I've heard it described by insiders is that Democrats will embrace diverse candidates once they start to become rising stars, but the Republicans have been very good about cultivating people. So it's not a lot of people, but the people that are out. When you think about it, like immediately you can think about rising stars in the Republican Party who are Latino or Asian American, and Marco Rubio and Bobby Jindal are two examples. So I don't know that. So my answer is sort of yes and no.
Hi, my name is Nick Montalto. I work as a consultant on immigration issues, and I'm kind of curious to know a little bit about the genesis of the New American Leaders Project and how it fits into ongoing efforts to promote immigrant leadership. I'm thinking of Coro and the New York Immigration Coalition and their efforts to develop immigrant leadership and where the project fits into that.
Okay, that's my second favorite subject after the New Majority. So I started the New American Leaders Project 3 years ago after having worked in a number of settings that promoted immigrant integration. I started it actually as a result of being at a number of meetings with immigrant rights advocates around comprehensive immigration reform, and in 2008, we were expecting a new Congress and a new president, and we were developing strategies on how to get the 270 votes for immigration reform. So it's 2013 now. And what I started to think about was, and actually one of our alum describes it better than I do, which is that it's very important to have allies because you can work with allies. But when you have family who really understand the experience, and family has good and bad, and I understand that. But it was, for me, the genesis of this idea was around how do we start to cultivate our own leaders so that half the battle is over, where you don't have to explain the problem. You have to help them figure out the solution, but you don't have to explain the problem. The model for the work is that we've worked very closely with other progressive candidate development groups, national groups, who have had a hard time recruiting diverse candidates in sort of shaping the curriculum. And we borrow a lot from the sort of traditional candidate development trainings. But Our curriculum has a values-based framework that emphasizes the immigrant story. It emphasizes how to mobilize your voter base, which may include new and first-time voters, which traditional candidates may not go after. Certainly they're not prime voters most of the time. And it emphasizes the importance of engaging immigrants as donors in your campaign. So even if they're small donors, the idea that low-income immigrants can contribute to the political process is a really empowering one for the people we train. To your question about the other organizations, so the way the model works is that it's primarily our programmatic focus right now is a weekend training. We work with local partners to do the recruitment. So obviously in New York, I'm fairly familiar with people in the immigrant community who could be potentially good candidates. But in other parts of the country, we have partners like the sort of peer groups of the New York Immigration Coalition, the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant Rights and Refugees, and One America in Washington State, etc. And they help us with local recruitment. Ruth mentioned that we will be doing a training here in March. It's March 8th and 9th. So for all of you who are really excited about politics and want to represent your communities, you can take the training. It's here at Eagleton, but it's in partnership with a number of organizations in the tri-state area. So New York Immigration Coalition being one of them. And the CORO program is not focused on political leadership, right? So we were very clear. People ask me this all the time. Do you train obviously, not everyone is going to go on and run for office, but our training is really geared to get people to run for office, work on campaigns, or seek appointed office, because that is a very particular type of impact that you can have that's different from running a nonprofit or even being an immigrant rights spokesperson in a number of settings.
Hi, my name's Kira. I was actually born in India and brought over here as a child and raised in America. So I identify as an American and then an Indian. Mm-hmm. But the question I have is, I was actually at a conference this weekend at Harvard, and they brought students from all over the country. And I was talking to students from Oklahoma, and they were telling me how they couldn't place some of their students in internship programs in Washington, D.C., because some of the students were of different ethnicities. Some were Indian, some were African Americans, and they had difficulty getting congressmen to take on these students as their interns. And I've never felt marginalized because of my identity, but people in other states, I've realized that it's a very different case. And how do we get those people to the point, there's still a lot of work to do here, but how do we get those people to change their mindsets?
Mm-hmm. Well, so, two things I would say to that. We need to change who's in Congress, wholesale change, right? But since that sadly takes a little bit of time, the most hopeful I have ever felt about our work is in Arizona. And if you remember, there was SB 1070, there's the textbooks issue there. That is a place that you expect to go to and be depressed about immigrants. You really do. But what happened, and not that I'm recommending that this happens in other state legislatures, but what happened is that the community really mobilized in response to what was going on. And there is a huge amount of immigrant activism there. Now, Arizona is a little different in that there are large numbers of immigrants. I think it is very hard when you are one of a few. And there are fewer places in the U.S. where that is the case, but still some. So what we saw in Arizona was that as a result of this activism, people were really energized to run for office. And it was the opposite of what I expected. We had the largest sort of return on investment, if you will, from our training last year. We trained 19 people, and 4 of them ran. One got elected to be the youngest school board member in the state of Arizona. The other person lost by 113 votes. But she ran against a long-term incumbent, and she ran a clean election, which meant that her campaign spending capped at $25,000, while her opponent could outspend her. And what happened as a result of that election is that the incumbent now is showing up at much higher rates to vote and to be in the conversation, because he realizes that there's a community that's going to hold him accountable. And so when I asked her if she's going to run again, she said, well, first I have to build back my savings up. But the other thing she said is, the reason that I ran was because the incumbent was not showing up for our community, but now he is. So that's a different kind of win. And I know that I'm not answering your question directly. I think that it's just a matter of time that these environments are going to change. And I just think it's ludicrous that Congress is not accepting. I mean, isn't there some sort of law about that? Like they should just sue them. I mean,
one of the students' names was Akash. So one of the students' names was Akash. So he was of South Asian descent.
Right.
And the congressman, the administrator was telling me that she couldn't find a congressman to take him because he thought it would hit his constituency, that his constituents wouldn't be happy with it because of the
It's a difficult name to pronounce, I imagine.
Oh, very difficult.
So
many letters, yeah.
Is that 1A, 3 A's? It's very confusing.
4 maybe, 4.
Yeah.
But yeah, it blew my mind.
Well, I think that this is an example of part of what I'm talking about, why it's so important. Like if we could just, if that congressperson would take that young person and find that because maybe the problem is not the constituents, right? That's what they think is the problem. And, back to that sort of ability to rule and alleviating of mistrust, all those reasons all those fears that we have about why a person of a certain background can't be representative, either as an legislative aide or as an elected official. It's just time. And I think the reason you're not experiencing this, I mean, can I tell a story? I know there's a lot of questions, but I want to tell you a little story about when I became Commissioner of Immigrant Affairs. So it was 2002, and I had just become a citizen in 2000, in December of 2000. So 2001 was my first election. And then, 6 months later, I was being interviewed by Mayor Bloomberg to be Commissioner of Immigrant Affairs, and I just thought I was like the cat's pajamas. Does anybody use that term? My husband laughs at me when I use that term. He's like, no one says that, so I had to Wikipedia it for him. But here I was, and I wouldn't have gotten the job if I was not a U.S. citizen. And the mayor actually asked me that question in the interview, which I'm not sure he was supposed to, but then Mayor Bloomberg, we love and hate him because he does things that he should and things that he shouldn't. And so here I was, an American citizen. I was in a government job, and there is nothing that could be more integrated than that, right? My dad, every time he would see me, would take like piles of business cards. I'm like, Dad, what are you doing with that? He goes, I just like to give it to people and show them that you're immigrants. Okay, so it was about 3 or 4 weeks in, and the New York Times did a public profile of me. Literally, it was that day. So I got up in the morning, and I opened the paper, and there was this huge picture of me. Picture that I was semi-happy with even, and so I had this newspaper with me the whole day, and I was getting all these emails. It was pre-Twitter, pre-Facebook, and people were just so happy. So I was literally walking on air, and I took the subway to a meeting, and I came out. It was 33rd Street and Park Avenue South, and I get out of the train. And I'm walking, and there's a guy standing at the bank, and he says to me, do you speak English? And it's like in a very in-your-face kind of way. And I just was so, I just came right down. Because I thought, you know what? All you see is the way that I look. You have no idea who I am. But all you see is the color of my skin and who you think that I might be. Because I'm pretty sure that I could pass for just about any one of the major ethnic groups, because people are, sort of always say that to me. And so it wasn't that he was pegging me as Indian American or Indian or anything, but the fact that just in that one statement I could be brought down, the thing that example, and even now I feel goosebumps when I tell that story, because what it reminded me of is that it really doesn't matter how far I come in life, because as long as my community and other communities like me don't feel that they are fully American, that other people don't see us as fully American, like my individual achievement is absolutely nothing in the face of that. Because just that statement, I'm telling you, I was on cloud 9, and it snapped me out of that right away. It was so immediate, because the feeling of not belonging is so much stronger than the feeling of belonging. And so the work that it takes to feel like we really belong is a much longer and harder road.
My name is Jagdish Vasudev. I'm the founder director of New Americans of New Jersey, a 501c3 we started in 2003. 10 years ago. I think we can create leaders to sort of to participate in the political field. I think our biggest challenge in the South Asian community, although I think I cover South Asian as well as Latinos, the biggest challenge among the immigrant communities is getting the voters to come out and vote.
Right.
Because you cannot, you can create a lot of leaders. I think we see a small number in the New Jersey legislature as well as some of the townships. There are two things we need. One is people to come out and vote,
right.
And second thing is it requires a lot of money to contest an election.
Yeah.
And just depending on the ethnic community to support financially is another challenge.
Right. I mean, I think that this is certainly among the South Asian community, it's a nationwide problem that there's just not enough registered voters. I mean, it took me 17 years to become a citizen, like without the disadvantage of language or undocumented status or any of that. It just takes time. And I think the people who there are fewer probably people who are eligible who are not becoming citizens, because I think in 2008 a lot of South Asians and other immigrants became citizens in order to vote for President Obama. I mean, the money issue, it's a real issue. I would say, though, that and I think, again, this is different in New Jersey, because I hear that the school board races are really hotly contested here in New Jersey. But in a lot of other parts of the country, I mean, in New York, New York City, we don't even have school boards. But in a lot of other parts of the country, it's a great entry point, and it's a very low barrier to entry. There's vacant seats that people can get pretty much, like they can run unopposed or they can get appointed for. So I almost feel, it's ironic because here in New York and New Jersey, we have the demographics and we have the diversity, and to some extent we have a lot of progressive policies that support integration, but the political scene is more depressing, I guess. Whereas when I go around the country, what I see is the opposite. I see there's a lot more potential on the political side because the barriers to entry, particularly around money, are lower. But then it's not very it's not as progressive, and it's not as diverse as some of these states. So, but I would love for you to recommend folks for our training here in New Jersey. You might have some folks who want to run. And yeah, I mean, I think it's a time issue. But also, I would say that one last thing on that is this is where I think that whole issue that I talked about of cross-racial coalition building is really important, right? I think if you can have a candidate who the South Asian community can get behind because they feel that person will represent their interests, that over time that creates a stronger belief in the government. I mean, I'll just tell another story. When I ran South Asian Youth Action, I remember, and this is an example that shows my real naivete, which is one of the reasons why I continue to do this work. That's really hard, actually. But we had a young person whose bike got stolen, and he came to the youth center, and he was telling me that his bike got stolen. And what is the first thing that you would ask him? What do you think I asked him? Well,
did you report it to the police?
That's the first thing I asked him. And he said, well, no. The police are not going to do anything. I'm going to go find the guy and beat him up. I was like, oh, okay, well, I see how that would produce a result, whereas reporting to the police wouldn't. And so, I think this idea of believing that government and government authorities are going to respond to you comes a little bit from having elected officials who matter. I mean, I feel like I could talk a lot about the South Asian community, not just because I'm South Asian, but also because that's what my dissertation is on. Is anyone here working on a dissertation? Okay, well, it's an awful, evil, terrible time of your life, just to prepare you for it. And so I'm finding that in the South Asian community, there is still, and again, I think this has broad applicability to other communities, we are still looking for legitimacy. And so what will happen is someone will run and you will support their campaign, especially if you can meet them and shake their hands. And this was a phenomenon that we sort of South Asian progressives would joke about. But now that I've gone deeper in my research, I understand how tied that is to legitimacy and credibility. Like, it's so great for you to be seen taking a picture with an elected official because it's like my dad giving out my business card. It shows that you have somehow arrived because you have some connection to someone in a position of power, and goes back to that how disempowered so many of us feel at so many different points. And this is not, certainly I get that this is not just immigrants that feel disempowered. We all, if you're a woman, if you're a member of any disadvantaged group, you felt that at different points. And it brings about such a strong desire to be accepted and to feel legitimate. And so you'll give $100 to your congressperson or $1,000. I mean, people give a lot of money just for that photograph and just for that semblance of a connection that is not necessarily substantive but has a real symbolic importance. If I give these long answers, then I won't get any questions. So maybe we should take 2 or 3 questions.
We can do that, and I want to make sure, I know there's a couple questions in the room, but that we get some of Professor Wallace's students to have an opportunity to ask a question. I think we have one right here, and then I'll pass the mic around.
Okay, and I'll give shorter answers now.
Hi, I'm Carolyn McGrover. I'm from Professor Wallace's class. And I was wondering, you as an individual, when you became a citizen, did you feel like you had to give up part of your South Asian identity to become an American citizen, to gain that?
Oh, there's no short answer to this. So very quickly, I will say that, I had already given up, or one of my citizenship sort of categories had been given up already without my input, right? Because we were Indian citizens and we moved to Belize, and then my parents, opted for Belizean citizenship. So when I had grown up in Central America at a time when, the U.S. was not exactly considered a non-invasive country. So it was harder for me from a symbolic standpoint. I am still able to keep my Belizean passport, and the only reason that I do that is because, so when I arrive in Belize, there's 2 lines, right? Just like we have here in the U.S., there's the line for Belizeans and for non-Belizeans, and I can't bring myself to stand in the non-Belizean line. But, so that's just a more, again, there's so much of this that's psychological. But the reason that I became a citizen, I'll tell you, there are 2, to be completely honest, I was also eligible for a couple of years before I became a citizen, for 2 reasons that I did it. One is that I was running a youth empowerment program that was encouraging people to integrate into the United States. So I was like, you need to become a citizen. The other thing, quite frankly, is that in January of, I guess it was 99, because I became a citizen in 2000, January of 99, they increased the fee, like by 3 times or something. And so a group of us got together and said, all right, well, I mean, we don't want to pay $400 and something when we finally get around to doing this. So we literally mailed in our application sort of a week before. And the thing about those 2 things, so there's a monetary issue and there's a psychological issue. People talk a lot about non-citizen voting. I think that it's one thing to have the right to vote. It's a completely other thing to feel like you are a welcome part of the process and that your voice matters. And so I think that there's legislative sort of priorities, and then there's this sort of more psychological and sort of symbolic thing. So I didn't feel the South Asian piece as much as I felt the Belizean in me, which is where my childhood was spent, was hard. Then I realized you could never give up the Caribbean if you're from there, so it's all good.
And before we move on, any other students from Professor Wallace's class that want to jump in? I know we have 2 questions that I'll get to next. Let me just take this one.
Hi, I'm Jen. Do you think there's like a direct connection between immigrants or individuals who like in Congress or in a position of power who assimilate to the point of Bobby Jindal, and how conservative they are, as opposed to other individuals who, like Sonia Sotomayor, who does have kind of really, like the Latino community accepted her with open arms and was very excited about her being appointed. So do you think there's kind of a connection between like Bobby Jindal, who's a Republican, which isn't really expected from somebody who would be like in that kind of position of power?
Well, I think the decision is, if I understand your question correctly, I think there is a very strategic decision that they make. Like if Bobby Jindal maybe was running in New York City, he may not necessarily have needed to make those choices. I mean, I think that, and they start young. You start at a very young age. I mean, if you're Akash in Oklahoma, maybe you start to think, well, maybe I am like, I don't know, Aki or something. I mean, I just, like you just make these decisions without thinking about the sort of deeper implications. But then I think when it comes to the race, yes, I mean, I do think that there is a link between where you're running. So it's not so much the party, although obviously there's a whole set of issues there. But I think it's like there are four governors who are Asian and Latino. There are 2 South Asians in southern states, and then there's Brian Sandoval in New Mexico. I'm sorry, Brian Sandoval in Nevada, and Susana Martinez in New Mexico, and they all happen to be Republican. So, I mean, I don't know, there are no Sonia Sotomayor, let me tell you that, in more ways than one. But Sonia Sotomayor is a New Yorker. So, she probably didn't have to make those same calculations when she was younger. Because I think it starts very early, too, and then it starts to get entrenched, so.
I think we have time for 3 last questions here. We'll start over here.
Let's take them all first, and then.
Hello, my name is Nihalaga. I'm a private wealth advisor with Ameriprise, and I just wanted to ask, we have been focusing so much on the role of immigration and immigrants in the United States. Have you, I don't know whether it's within your scope or no, whether you have also looked at how we compare vis-a-vis other developed nations in terms of how immigrants are performing in areas of business and politics and other related disciplines, vis-a-vis us, how we are doing when we compare ourselves to other developed nations like Canada and Europe and other countries,
Why don't we take the other couple of questions, and then I can try to
Ma'am,
do
we'll
one
take your
answer.
question, and then we'll go to the other side of the room.
Suzanne Clark, I'm a longtime resident of New Jersey and a teacher in an immigrant community. When you were talking about deracialized candidates in the beginning, would you say that a deracialized candidate and a new majority candidate are opposite sides of the same coin? Because I was thinking, for instance, of Marco Rubio. Some people might consider him a new majority candidate. I would think from your description, you would consider him a deracialized candidate.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering if they aren't sort of opposite sides of the same coin, and how can we judge which they are, really?
Right. Someone else had a question back here, right? Sorry.
We've been waiting for a while.
I'm going to come back to all those.
I'm Zooey Agrawal. I'm a master's student at the Blaustein School and a fellow here. So you were talking about a lot of firsts, like Bobby Jindal being the first Indian governor, President Obama being the first African-American president. What do you think is our biggest challenge in balancing the expectations from their respective minority or immigrant communities, and then also being a really successful policymaker and making sure that they also represent their respective state or the United States and kind of those challenges?
So let me go from the concrete to the sort of abstract, because that's a good point, I think, to end on. So no, I have not looked very specifically at the data. I mean, I know that we don't do as well in terms of women's representation as other countries, right? Would you say that's fair to say, Debbie? I have looked much more at integration issues in Europe, and I think that in this country, because we are so focused on the individual and the kind of like, let's pull ourselves up by the bootstrap and do what we need to do, that the government doesn't invest as much in integration. But it's a two-way street, right? Like how well someone is going to do in this country is partially based on who they are and what they're doing, and partially based on the structures within which they're operating. And I feel like we don't, as a country, do as much to think about those structures. And part of the work of the New American Leaders Project is we always say this, we don't just train immigrants. Like, it's not enough that you happen to be immigrant. It's important that you demonstrate an understanding of your community's needs, a connection to those communities, and therefore we expect that is some predictor that when you get into office that you're going to really represent those needs. Because even if we get immigration reform, what's going to happen? Like, we still have integration issues that we need to deal with prior to and after immigration reform. So how well a business person does here and all of that, I think, is, I think that some of that really depends on, like, let's put it this way. I don't think it should be by chance that someone succeeds, which I think, in a lot of situations in the U.S., it's because you really stepped way outside of your comfort zone to get to where you needed to be. It's a little bit of a myth that we make it easy and warm and welcoming for everyone to succeed. I think you, certainly in places like New York, you got to be really tenacious to succeed. I think to your question, I guess I would say that in some cases it's a bit, part of both the challenge and the ease of being in academia, I'm finding, is that you can create these categories and try to place people in them, but of course that's not how reality works. And my guess is that, it's become a little cooler to be a Latino Republican than it used to be. So for someone like Senator Rubio, maybe I haven't studied his sort of early background, but maybe it was easier to be more deracialized at a certain point, and now it's a little easier to sort of break into Spanish every now and then. And, and again, that doesn't make you necessarily a new majority candidate. But the distinction between the deracialized and the new majority is that deracialized candidates just de-emphasize any ethnic cues whatsoever, so that unless, they have, especially if they're phenotypically white, then you don't necessarily theoretically wouldn't know. This is murky territory, so this could be a long answer, but maybe we can talk about it afterwards. I'd say it's a bit of a spectrum that some people move back and forth on. But it's also a strategy, I guess. So I'm not sure, what happens in Bobby Jindal's home or Marco Rubio's home. I think they make political calculations about how they're going to present themselves. And that's probably where the categories make more sense than sort of who they are as individuals. Do you buy that? Is that a good answer? I definitely think it's cooler to be immigrant than it used to be. It's not as cool as I'd like it to be, but it's definitely cooler. And the dot head thing, just to flash back to the 80s, it was the late 80s, right, that they had the dot busters. Does anybody remember? So I remember being so struck by, shortly thereafter, Madonna started doing this video where she was wearing a bindi. And I was like, it's not okay that when you wear it, it's cool and fashionable, and when I wear it, it's something that I get targeted for. That's not okay. And that's the kind of nuance that, even my parents, right? So if my parents see Madonna wearing a bindi, they think, wow, that's so great. Look, people love our culture. And I'm like, no, let me tell you how that works, Mom. So it's very different, right? There is that, but for them, there is a sense of acceptance, right? That this person has accepted our culture. But the difference between someone who looks a certain way wearing a bindi versus, people who look a different way is not a nuance. That is a pretty clear distinction. The first issue. I think that, we have a whole conference. Thankfully, Ruth teed me up to say all the right things about what I need to get out here. There was a training in March, and then there's a training in Washington that is called Power and Policy. And there's two issues that we're looking at, two sort of particular goals that we have for that conference. And one is to showcase that the audience for that conference are local and state elected officials. And one goal is to uplift best practices in immigrant integration policy. So the kinds of things that have happened across the country that legislators have been champions of, and having them talk about how they conceive that policy and politically what were the strategies to get it passed and implemented. But the other part of it is leadership practice. And in that leadership practice sort of bucket, we include a number of folks who are going to have conversations about how people perceive them because they might be the only Latino or the only Asian American. And how do they navigate that sort of challenge of representing their ethnic community as well as a broader constituency? How do they navigate that surrogate representation, right? So if you happen to be, say, I mean, it's not probably the case so much with Latinos in certain parts of the country, but what does it mean to be representing a much bigger community outside of your own constituency, and how do you navigate that? And I think it's really hard for people. And I think it goes back to your question that there are people who then choose to suppress their sort of interest in their own community as a survival mechanism, right? Like I don't want to do, I'm not going to go to events where, or I'm not going to, this is actually a real life example from my own life, which I won't give you too many details because I don't want to, I think if you do the mapping, you'll be able to figure out who it is. But someone I worked with said to me, well, you know, I never speak Spanish when I go to events, even though I can speak Spanish. I just don't want people to see me that way. And I'm like, okay, that seems sort of odd, but like it was a decision she had made because she didn't want to be perceived as the Latino in the administration. You know, when I was Commissioner of Immigrant Affairs, inevitably I got more invitations to do South Asian things. And I probably, if you go back and look at it, I probably did more South Asian things. But you know why I did more South Asian things? Because I got more invitations to do South Asian things. And I had to be really conscious of that dynamic because I was representing the city of New York and all immigrants. But there is that thing where people saw me as their representative. And the other communities sort of came to me more for policy issues and advocacy, but the South Asians invited me to everything, like their children's, you know, birthday parties, and I mean, literally, like it was like that. And so you do have to balance that because but I think, again, just in closing, I'll say that it goes back to what I was saying earlier, like we will all be better off if our elected officials think about the various groups and constituencies and stakeholders they're representing. And I think, you know, certainly in my own role as an appointed official and in the conversations that I've had with elected officials, it's not easy. I mean, what is easy is doing the thing that you're most comfortable with. And so it does take some work, but I think it's our responsibility as public servants, and it's your responsibility as voters to really hold people accountable to represent not just one group within their community, but everybody and every voice.